أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله فإن الله تعالى مع المتقين وبعد. Some points of reflection bi'idhnillah for us to consider as a community, locally and at large, based upon that which is taking place currently in Sham and that which has taken place over the last few days. Firstly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَمَا النَّصْرُ إِلَّا مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَكِيمِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us that victory does not come except from Allah Azza wa Jal. And we could perhaps spend some time reflecting over the term Nasr. What does Nasr mean? What does victory mean? Because victory is not simply that we establish on this earth that which is pleasing to Allah Azza wa Jal, but sometimes victory is that you remain firm upon your principles even when faced with that which is the worst we can face in this dunya, death, loss of life, torture, and so on and so forth. That itself is victory. That's a nasr, a victory. And any victory that we receive as individuals or as a collective, we receive it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But of course there are asbab. Allah Azza wa Jal in the Quran gives us reasons, qualities that we can use to determine how close perhaps we are, how far away perhaps we are from victory. And the best example to look at is the example of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam and the seerah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. And if you look to the beginning, without knowing the end, you perhaps will not see where the victory is going to come from for the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, except for the fact that you know he is a Prophet, Rasulullah, and he is Mansur. Wa'dullah, it's the promise of Allah Azza wa Jal. You know that the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam eventually was granted victory. Why? Because we here today are Muslims. But if you look to the beginning of his affair, you might ask yourself, where does the victory come from? If you haven't heard his life before reading it or listening to it, etc. The Prophet ﷺ was faced by his community as an enemy. They called him a liar. They called him a magician. They called him a fortune teller. They called him a poet. They called him a person who wanted to divide, etc., etc. They boycotted him. He lost family members. Companions were tortured. He was kicked out of his land. His closest protection, both outer and inner, passed away in the same year. Abu Talib and Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha. And the Prophet ﷺ was left in a state. Where is the victory going to come from? In Ta'if, in fact, when he was pelted and he was bleeding due to the pelting he received from the lowly parts of society, the sufaha, those who cannot think for themselves, those who are incited by those above who manipulate. He was pelted, bleeding. He was being mocked. He felt he has no one to support him. He turned to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and what did he say? As long as you're pleased with me, I accept whatever happens to me. Ya Allah. That was the mindset. But did the Prophet ﷺ stop? No. Why? Because he knew Wa'ad Allah is going to take place. The promise of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's promise. Likewise, we can look to other prophets. Musa alayhi salam. When Musa was being faced by Fir'aun, Banu Israel were questioning Musa. They said to him, we've been harmed prior to your arrival and we're being harmed after your arrival. Musa, what are you doing with us? The Red Sea is in front of us and Fir'aun's behind us. And what did he say? Musa alayhi salam, Kalla, inna ma'ya rabbi sayahdeen. No, Allah is with me and He will guide me. And he hit the sea with the stick, the water parted, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroyed Fir'aun and his army with his soldiers, his junood. But what junood at that time? Water, waves. That which you would never assume, you would never see coming. Likewise, in fact, if you look to the arrival of the Prophet ﷺ from a political perspective, and you look at the Sahaba and the victories achieved in defeating the Byzantine, sophisticated, civilized, battle-hardened, militarily mighty. They had the best of weapons, the best of training, the best of military formations, feared. But the Sahaba defeated them. How? Of course, we can go to the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَالْعَاقِبَ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. The end result will be for the people of taqwa. Yes, but if you look from a political perspective, at that time, what had been taking place? The Persians and the Romans had been fighting each other, continually fighting each other. They were both weakened from the battles that were taking place between themselves. And you might see some similarities today. And of course, there are going to be theories, there are going to be opinions, there are going to be views. Those who are qualified and those who are unqualified will have something to say about what's happening. But ultimately, who is in control? Allah Azza wa Jalla. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us a verse or verses of the Quran that we, as a collective, perhaps repeat over and over again. يَكِيدُونَ كَيْدًا وَأَكِيدُ كَيْدًا. They plot and they plan, but Allah tells us He plans. He plans. And the enemies of Islam, أعداء الدين, أعداء Allah, أعداء الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام, they don't realize and they don't consider that they themselves are pawns on the board game that is this life. They themselves are pawns. Allah Azza wa Jal is using them as a part of His plan. Simple. You look to history and you zoom out and you get the picture. Whenever the Muslims become attached to this dunya, whenever the Muslims start to lose their way, what happens? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends to them a calamity in the form of enemies who swipe at them and who humiliate them and who put them in positions that they don't want to be. What happens? They start to revive themselves. like a body. Like a body. A virus enters, the body starts to fight back. But how does the collective of Islam fight back? By reattaching itself to the rope of Allah. At-taqwa. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the enemies of Islam in favor of Ahlul Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses them against themselves. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about them, يَعْلَمُونَ ظَاهِرًا مِنَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. They know something which is only apparent. It's surface level, shallow. They don't understand what's happening behind the curtain. And so they plot and they plan based upon what they can assess and what they can understand, but they cannot assess and understand everything because what they know is shallow, it's surface level. We, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as Muslims, Ahlul Islam, Ahlul Iman, Allah has given us insight. Allah has given us insight. What's the insight? Allah Azza wa Jal, He tells us, do not concern yourself with the beginning, do not concern yourself with the middle, concern yourself with the end. How? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us, قال موسى لقومه استعينوا بالله واصبروا إن الأرض لله يورثها من يشاء من عباده والعاقبة للمتقين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us on the tongue of Musa, Musa said to his people, be patient, استعينوا بالله واصبروا. Seek aid in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, i.e. your attachment with Allah, your salah, your relationship with Allah Azza wa Jal. Be patient upon the difficulties you face currently and in the middle of this journey. Inna al-arda lillah. This earth belongs to Allah Azza wa Jal. And then what does He say? يُرِثُهَا مَن يَشَاءُ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ. He gives it and inherits it to whomever He chooses from His servants and His slaves. But then Allah tells us about the end. وَالْعَاقِبَةِ. Al-aqibah, skip to the end of the story. We know what happens. وَالْعَاقِبَةِ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. The end result is for who? The people of taqwa. So what is our mission? What is our mission as individuals and as a collective? Our mission is simple. To adorn ourselves with the qualities of taqwa, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will do the rest. That's it. But at-taqwa is not simply praying 5 times a day. At-taqwa is not simply fasting. At-taqwa is not simply zakah. No. Those are ritualistic aspects of at-taqwa. But what is the core, lubbu taqwa? What is it? It's tarkud dunya. Tarkud dunya. To leave off this life. To leave off this life. That's what the core quality of taqwa is. From that, everything else emerges. When a person has left off this life and has attached his or her heart to the akhirah, to Allah Azza wa Jal, you don't need to convince that person to come to the masjid. You don't need to convince that person to learn about their deen. You don't need to convince that person to give charity. You don't need to convince that person to fast. That person will do all of those things and more voluntarily. Why? Because they are preparing for the next life. That's their concern. Whereas when a person's heart is attached to this dunya, what are they going to do? They're going to give preference to this life over the next, in the ritual aspects and in the major aspects of the deen. They're going to put the mortgage before staying away from riba. They're going to put the pleasure of zina before staying away from it. They're going to put collecting things of this dunya, pleasure, etc. before the idea of pleasing Allah Azza wa Jal. And if there is an opportunity of leadership that comes its way for the ummah, those whose hearts are attached to this life, they will take that position for the function of dunya, not for the function of the akhirah. Contrary to the Sahaba utilized positions of leadership, utilized positions of strength, utilized wealth, utilized anything that they had possible for what? for the akhirah. And so they were Mansureen. Compare them to Banu Israel. Banu Israel preferred this dunya. Banu Israel, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala freed them from the shackles of slavery. Literally. Freed them from the shackles of slavery. But their hearts and their minds were enslaved. They came across a people worshipping idols. What did they say? Immediately after being freed from Fir'aun, liberated by Allah Azza wa Jal himself, they came across idol worshippers. What did they say? Oh Musa, give us an idol to worship like these people have idols. The hearts were enslaved. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instructed them to enter into the promised land. What did they say? You and your Lord go, Musa, and fight. There are people in there, powerful. What's the problem? What's the problem? They don't want to lose their lives. They don't want to put into positions of discomfort and harm and pain and suffering for the sake of a greater cause. Their hearts were attached to this dunya. And so, they were not from the party of the victorious. And so, when we look at what's happening in Sham right now, put all of the theories to the side. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has removed a tyrant. And the videos, the information about this person's tyranny are explicit and available for all to see. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has removed this person in a manner which no one was expecting. In a manner which no one was expecting. This is a part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's plan. It's a part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's plan. And no matter what is taking place, al-aqiba lil-muttaqeen. The end result is for the people of taqwa. And so we can look, those whom Allah granted that victory to on the ground in Sham, what are some of the qualities that they have? Firstly, we find them praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the victory. Secondly, we find that prior to this endeavor of removal of a tyrant, they united their ranks. They united their ranks. There were small groups that came together as a larger group to face off against a tyrant. And our ummah, if you study the history of our ummah never, ever is defeated by an external enemy except that there are internal problems. The only time we are defeated as an ummah is when there are internal problems. When the internal problems are solved, the external threat is irrelevant. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us as an ummah strength. Strength. We have strength of mind. We have strength of heart. We have strength of body. We have strength of pocket. The weakness that we have currently is that we are not united. We are not united. We're like a body and the body parts are scattered. Useless. But when the body parts come together, you have a fully functional organism. That is our ummah. And if you look through history, as was just mentioned, you will find that there is a correlation between unity and internal strength and position externally on the global scale. And so we as an ummah have to focus on being united. Unity. And unity does not mean uniformity. We do not have to be uniform in thinking to be united as an ummah. We can have our differences. Whether those differences are in aqeedah, or are in fiqh, or are in manahij. It doesn't matter how we cross the bridge. What matters is that we cross the bridge and we avoid the water below together. That's what unity is. And in order to be united, we have to be mature in thinking. We have to be mature in thinking. And this is why it's very upsetting to see that a united front in Sham has led to disunity amongst Muslims in the West. How so? Muslims arguing over their theories. Muslims arguing over support or lack of support. Muslims arguing about individuals. Muslims arguing about what comes next. Do we not learn? We need to learn from what's happened. Be united. United. And any component of our ummah that is calling for disunity in a time like this, there should be question marks over that component. Any individual, any body, any group that are calling for disunity or causing disunity within the ranks of Islam today, there should be a massive question mark over that body, individual, group, etc. Even if that person calls himself a sheikh, put a question mark over him. If he's calling for disunity in these times. If his only job, شغله الشاغل, is to disunite and to call out the problems of others and to focus on other groups, put a question mark over that person's head. Because we currently don't have a house, and so we shouldn't be engaging in conversations about the color of the paint. We don't have a foundation, and you're going to criticize someone's views about the roof. Makes no sense. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله وحده وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء ومن تبعه وبعد. What has happened in Sham is a reminder from Allah Azza wa Jal that the situation for our ummah and for the nations can change very quickly. And if you zoom out and look at history over the last 200 to 300 years, you see that. You see that. Power is not in the hand of man, it's in the hand of Allah Azza wa Jal, and He gives it to whomever He so chooses for whatever reason He has. But Allah has given us as an ummah certain khasa'is. Allah has given us special treatment. What is that treatment? Allah has told us that for us to be victorious, to be granted power by Allah Azza wa Jal, is not dependent upon our material state. Other nations, yes, it's dependent upon material state. For us, no. It's dependent upon at-taqwa. And taqwa, if we look at the Quran, necessitates that we are materially strong. Necessitates that we are intellectually awake. Necessitates that we have direction. Necessitates that we are educated. Taqwa is something which encompasses everything that is necessary to establish that which is pleasing to Allah Azza wa Jal. For example, if I want to be a righteous man and I have a family at home, it's not sufficient that I'm in the masjid praying 5 times a day and I'm neglecting my family. No, I have to earn a living. I have to raise my children. I have to tend to the needs of my wife. Therefore, everything which is necessary for me to do all of those things, I have to also engage in. Likewise, if we think as a collective on a global scale, in order to be an ummah of taqwa, it necessitates that we engage in everything which is needed to establish everything pleasing to Allah Azza wa Jal. The core of that, unity. Unity. And what has been achieved in Sham should be a lesson for us. It should be a lesson for us. And just to conclude, as was mentioned, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَالْعَاقِبَ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. The end result is for the people of taqwa. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has informed us throughout the Quran about His promises. إِنَّهُ لَا يُفْلِحُ الظَّالِمُونَ, for example. The people of oppression will never be successful in this life or the next. أَلَا إِنَّ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ قَرِيبٌ. The victory of Allah is close. When the Prophet and his people were asking, مَتَى نَصْرُ اللَّهِ? When is the victory of Allah? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds, it's close. We know that Allah is going to grant victory to the believers on this earth. It's wa'dullah. وَلَا يُخْلِفُ اللَّهُ وَعْدَهُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not break His promises. It's maqdoor. Anyone who does not believe this has a problem in their belief system. We don't need to question whether or not the Ummah of Islam is going to be victorious. It will be victorious. What we need to question is whether or not I, as an individual, we as a collective, my progeny, whether we are going to be a part of the victory of Allah that has been guaranteed to this Ummah. That's what we need to ask. And if we want to be a part of that equation, then we need to work on ourselves and we need to adorn ourselves with the quality of the attributes of the people who are going to be victorious. That, again, to conclude, as I began, is our mission. To be adorned with the qualities of al-Mansureen, those who are granted victory by Allah Azza wa Jal. And so when I open the Quran and I read the Quran, I need to read it with that picture in my mind. Who has Allah promised victory to? What are their qualities? And I need to adorn myself with those qualities. Fixing the heart, removing from the heart attachment to everything other than Allah Azza wa Jal. Removing from the heart love of dunya. Removing from the heart hatred and dislike for my brothers and sisters in Islam. Looking at the akhlaq of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Understanding my purpose in life. All of these things, Allah has informed us in the Quran. Looking at people as Allah describes them. Allah tells us about people. Allah informs us who they are. Allah gives us their signs. And so, what has happened in Sham should wake us up. It should wake us up. And should allow us to realize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's plans have been ordained and they are going to come to fruit. I just need to make sure that I'm a part of the equation. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make that the case. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim إنك حميد مجيد وارض اللهم عن أبي بكر وعن عمر وعن عثمان وعن علي وعن سائر الصحابة أجمعين اللهم تب علينا واعف عنا إنك أنت العفو الكريم اللهم استعملنا يا رب العالمين ولا تستبدلنا يا مجيب الدعوات اللهم انصر إخواننا في أنحاء العالم يا رب العالمين واجعلنا من الناصرين للدين اللهم ارفع راية الإسلام واجعلنا من الرافعين له اللهم انصر إخواننا في فلسطين اللهم عليك بالظالمين فإنهم لا يعجزونك وأقم الصلاة